Welcome to Are There Pure Evil, the series where I defend or propose characters on the subject of whether or not they are pure evil, as defined in the introduction video. Is Dio pure evil? He certainly would be if the part 3 of his series existed in a vacuum, but no, Dio is not pure evil. This is going to be an analysis on that, particularly covering the aspects that may not make Dio pure evil rather than the aspects that would, or every evil act he has ever done. I consider the latter to be pretty well understood by fans or anyone able to watch a review of his life, whereas I believe that there are misconceptions about the aspects that may not make Dio pure evil. As a reference for that, I will break down claims the pure evil wiki uses for Dio that are flat out wrong along the way. Let's start! There are a few tragic elements that Dio had to deal with when growing up. The first one is living in the slums of the UK. We at least see that this meant working to gain money, and the story points out how the poor wanting to be rich like the nobleman was something very common. It can be inferred that Dio had to suffer the same as any other poor people, but not much of this is shown. Instead, Dio is shown calm and presentable at almost all times. Should this imply that his past in poverty is irrelevant, since after all Dio doesn't seem bothered by it? Not quite. Dio likes being number one. His refined act is a mask on internal impulses he has that are his true self. While the idea of his mask is used to point out an adult Dio being the worst human being in a moment of gory rage, I would argue that he had it since he was a kid too as a coping mechanism, masking not an irredeemable maniac yet, but a more understandable rage given his circumstances. We will go over this later. Calm as he may seem, Dio can be ticked off rather easily if the right nerve is touched on. That is what you would call an emotionally unstable person with unresolved issues, not someone truly calm and collective, even if they act in the latter way most of the time. Regardless of this, poverty on its own is a tragic background no one deserves, even if anyone were to make it through it by their own hard work efforts to improve themselves and luck and then never complain about it. It is still an unjust social problem the fact that they had to live through it in the first place. Given his poverty and how he likes being number one could infer Dio picked up the ladder due to being looked down by society. In the anime, this assumption is far easier to make due to abuse being shown to Dio even outside his house, but this is not in the original manga. Granted, some random bullies do point out feeling the rich to look down on them, so who knows, either the environment partially caused Dio to feel this way like those bullies, or Dio came up with this idea on his own simply due to being evil. Lastly, another reasonable assumption based on the information the story gives us. Dio's high combat skills in boxing may be telling, as one could imagine he had to quickly learn to defend himself at a very competent level to be safe or simply feel safe in the slums. Consider how Dio expected JoJo to die by exploring what was presumably the same place where he lived as a kid, being surprised when he came back unharmed, and how Speedwagon point out how dangerous it is to live in the slums. Then again, it's likely that, to a degree, Dio learned boxing for sadistic fun to further feel on top, or knowing that he could use it in the future for his own evil needs. Still, let's not be naive about it. Dio's only shown to be a great boxer against another kid of his same age, and only once he already had some experience in boxing. If an even younger, helpless Dio never got assaulted by someone older than him, then at the very least he would always have to come out of his house knowing the possibility of getting robbed in the streets. The second tragic aspect in his upbringing is having an abusive, alcoholic father. Any of these two elements alone is enough to say that anyone came from a tragic background, but there is more to it. We explicitly see how this upbringing affects Dio's way of thinking and goals in life during his internal monologue after he killed his father. Dio accepts his father telling him to become the richest of them all as a challenge, possibly taking in how he told him to never lose to anyone too, if so affecting his need to be number one. Dio was rageful at his father, very rageful, feeling sick just thinking that his blood flows in his veins. He developed into a person willing to be rageful at anyone in his way. Sadly, to a degree, that is how someone could turn out in his context. While Dio is clearly on the wrong for choosing immoral ways to achieve his goals, and he did worse than what most in his situation would have dared, there is a level of conditioning present here that any kid living his same life would be lucky to not get morally compromised by. I consider Dio's outlook on life and willingness to follow his father's wishes for himself through evil to be something tragic. One argument the Pure Evil wiki uses is that Dio chose to renounce his goodness even after getting a better life from the Joestar family, and while this is in fact pretty evil from his part, it's important to notice that he entered that family after the aforementioned monologue and gaining that outlook on life, with his mind already set on his evil goal against that family. He never opened up to them under love because he already had set in stone that he would fake any positive interaction with them for his goals to work. He didn't need to choose this, of course, he could have been softened by then and thus dropped his evil goals. There is also the factor of Dio's intelligence to consider, in this case screwing his own chances of being a better person. Dio is a very competent individual, but his intelligence is built to best serve himself, looking up for himself as best as possible in a harsh environment, but not as morally as possible. And Dio builds up a surprising amount of experience up to his father's death, daring to buy poison to kill his father, a plot one would expect out of an adult. When joining the Joestars, if showing no vulnerability and not caring for them best serves his goals, then Dio will competently show no vulnerability nor care for them. A pity, considering all those years with JoJo did mean something for Dio in the end, but more on this later. Specifically, Dio at first decided to psychologically torture JoJo since, in his mind, that would leave him to be the only heir of the Joestars, beyond JoJo as a secret enemy from day one. Doing this, Dio slightly traps himself, in quotation marks, in his own way of thinking for his end goal to work. He should have seen a psychiatrist instead, but how would anyone know the secret plot of this kid? Again, Dio didn't need to be so stubborn about his goals, and he is in fact accountable for them and an evil character even at this age because of his actions. I simply argue that it's more complex than him having simply renounced his goodness even after being with the Joestars. Dio came to them beyond rotten and hiding all the issues that a happy family could have fixed to succeed in his evil plan. The first redeeming quality Dio ever showed is care and love for his mother. Note that I didn't say presumable love, which I would respect to say if needed to. Dio first calls out his dead father for sending his mother to her grave, which, being cynical, wouldn't mean much on his own. The second time she's referenced is more interesting. Dio Brando, Dio's father, tells Dio to sell his dead mother's dress to gain money to buy alcohol for himself. Dio's shocked by this, as he looks at his mother's dress. Then Dio disrespects his mother and falls asleep like a baby. Dio is enraged at him, cries, and in his thoughts calls out his father for having worked his mother to death. This is what makes me say that Dio genuinely loved his mother. Years later, Dio hears a random man disrespect his mom on the strip and rages into one initial attack because of it, if what happened next is not related to his mom at all. So, no moment is shown between Dio and his mother, yet he loves her. More to it, to allow herself to be worked to death and being with someone abusive and alcoholic while in poverty, some unhappy things can be inferred from her time alive with Dio, which the smart boy experienced. She was at least a pushover, powerless in her character to change the context she lived in. Potentially, she could have been as abusive as Dio, but this is an assumption. This would recontextualize Dio's self-hatred for drinking like his father did. It wouldn't simply mean that terrible thing father did around me at home, but potentially that terrible thing father did around me and mother at home, which is, still, no redeeming quality, but somewhat pitiful to think about. Lastly, about his mother, there is the factor of the thought, wisdom and morals, or the lack thereof, Dio would gain when growing up. His father was only shown to be amoral across the story, save for his care for Dio. What could be expected from his mother? His mother, who stood with someone abusive and alcoholic and that allowed herself to be worked to death. Well, it is an assumption, but I believe that it would be somewhat safe to say that at least his evil father had more of an influence over Dio than his mother did. Even if we give her the benefit of the doubt and assume that she tried to raise Dio as well as any decent mother would. Assuming a bit further than this, she was probably too dumb to raise Dio in any moral way that one would consider standard. After all, she chose an evil man as her husband and remained with him for years. Being a victim doesn't inherently make her a morally decent person. Either way, whichever way you think is the safest and or most logical way to assume both of his parents raised him, it only applies when his mother was still alive. The last tragic element in Dio's life is the death of his mother. no doubt causing Dio grief given his love for her, and leaving Dio to be raised only by his evil father in between that point and his time with the Joestars. Assuming Dario cared to raise his son at all, he is sure to give him selfish advice, normalizing to the young boy how you can screw over the rest of society if it benefits you, worse even, implying by example that you can have a blast at their misery and stupidity. It's possible that the smart boy Dio educated himself to an unknown degree, which could be minor or major, yet this would very logically lead to a very selfish way of thinking, given the context of his life so far. A factor often forgotten about Dio is the further evil the stone mask granted him when he became a vampire. Although this is no redeeming quality nor much of a tragic aspect of his life, it simply means that an outside source caused Dio to have further evil than how he would on his own. One could say that it was Dio's fault for using the mask, and that is in fact correct, but only one way to look at it. To that we may add, Dio just wanted the power. It wasn't Dio's fault that the mask had this evil side effect on users, and he is technically a victim of it. But that's about it, a rather small connotation that doesn't change things too much. One thing that could be viewed as a redeeming quality on Dio depends on what you consider to be a redeeming quality in the first place. I'm talking about the respect he had developed towards JoJo by the end of part 1. Let's break it down. At first, Dio had no issue killing JoJo personally, until he got defeated in the Joestar mansion. After that, Dio sent his minions to kill JoJo rather than doing it himself because of some minor discomfort it caused Dio to do it himself, given their shared history. Something that was not enough to stop Dio from again wanting to kill JoJo himself when the latter faced him. Getting defeated once more, Dio now comes to admire JoJo for his spirit, courage and power, the latter of which he plans to steal for himself by killing JoJo, which doesn't actually negate how he admires his spirit and courage. Dio says that he respects JoJo, in part because without him, he would have never gained the power of the stone mask. Dio aims to kill JoJo with his newly discovered eye technique, not wanting JoJo to suffer as his final courtesy. Then being frustrated when JoJo tried to dodge the attack and this resulted in an injury that would kill JoJo slowly and painfully, as Dio wanted JoJo to die instantly and without suffering. Later still, when a dying JoJo fights back, one of Dio's minions aims to beat the shit out of JoJo, but Dio says that he won't forget any disrespect towards him, commands his minions to show respect to JoJo and to quickly slice off his head without any pain. So, once more, this could be seen as a redeeming quality, depending on one's standards. Dio wants to kill JoJo and steal his body, which is very evil, but at the same time, Dio respects JoJo enough for himself to want to kill him without intentionally making JoJo suffer, and demands this much on others along with respect to JoJo. Personally, I don't believe this is the type of behavior a character labeled as pure evil should show. Ever, not because of the personal respect towards JoJo and the weird, fanatic admiration, which I believe any pure evil character should be able to show, but because of the admiration that covers his spirit, a positive quality in a person, bothering to kill JoJo in a matter that won't make him suffer and commanding another to respect him, all of which showing a tiny degree of good. This is not to ignore the fact that the event was more evil than good, and that even counting it tiny action by tiny action, they would all be more evil than good, as they all had as an end goal to kill someone and steal their body. Now let's go over some arguments the Pure Evil wiki uses. Against Dio's love for his mother it says, Dio seemingly loses this quality sometime after renouncing his humanity. Is this correct? Well, if they mean loses this quality as in, to their standards his evil actions outweighed it, therefore it should be ignored now, sure for them. If they mean Dio literally loses his love for his mom, not really, nothing seemingly implies it because the topic isn't touched upon again. Dio is still able to feel love, but we will go over this later. Dio's mother is never referenced again, therefore there is no way of knowing if there is any change in the way he feels towards her. As a vampire, a further evil is amp in Dio. This is what makes any regular human kill their friends and family to use them as food. Yet Dio had enough self-control that he committed to display his respect towards JoJo in a way that was unproductive to his goal of killing him, something that puts Dio's self-control as a vampire in a way that's more decent than any other human turn into one. Say for Straizo. Even if Dio is more evil than them by his own free will, remember, it isn't portrayed that vampires turn into monsters for a while and then regain their own personalities. No, they remain evil. The amount of investment any vampire must put into any small act of decency is nothing short of admirable. As such, it wouldn't be correct to say that Dio stopped loving his mom simply due to becoming a vampire. Maybe they mean renouncing his humanity as in, since Dio views himself to be above the human race, it must mean that he doesn't care about anyone in the human race, which wouldn't be entirely true. Dio does view himself above humans. He in fact doesn't care about most of the human race, but that's not the same as not caring about 100% of all humans. It's proven with JoJo that he can come to not treat them all the same, and note that JoJo is the cause of Dio having not taken over the world yet, as Dio himself points out, whereas his mom is likely to be less hated by Dio and is someone that he already loved, so the argument is wrong. It also claims that Dio seemingly loved his mother, which is an inaccurate wording. There is enough information to say that he did in fact love his mother, as I went over before. He claims that Speedwagon, who had a similar life, calls out how evil he still is as part of the reasons as to why Dio's background doesn't matter. However, this is not what they think it is. It was a bit of a subversion by way of Speedwagon being wrong, not just in retrospect from what we already knew of Dio, but from what he was yet to do in part 1. It was all somewhat hard to see based on all the evil things Dio did across the part, hence making it something subtle. Well, to be specific, we don't know what exactly Speedwagon meant by pure evil. Why would it, for example, remove Dio's love for his mother? I'm also not sure what he meant by he's been evil since he drew his first thread. Surely Speedwagon is exaggerating purposely or not, right? Or maybe, worst case scenario, this sniffing power he has is so good and Dio is such a psychopath that he was born destined to do evil by nature. This is obviously not what they were going with, but even entertaining that idea, if it needs to be said, there is something tragic about a human being born evil from their first breath. I would expect a pure evil character to have a fair amount of free will, as covered in the introduction video, and to note, I don't think Dio is a born psychopath, but that he was formed as a sociopath at some point in his life. It should also be noted just how similar Speedwagon is along with the bad people he sniffed. They grew up in poverty and so did Dio, so they have that in common. But then Dio also had an abusive, alcoholic, evil father and his mother died. Believe it or not, these are factors very hard to find even among poor people. Now, let's talk about Danny, the dog Dio burned alive for the emotional impact it would cause JoJo. Dio planned to make JoJo mad by leaving him friendless, knew that Danny was his friend, but at first did nothing about it. Later, after JoJo rightfully beat up Dio, Dio sent his dog to die to cope with the humiliation of that defeat. An extremely evil action. However, let's look at how a kid Dio early into joining the Joestars is doing evil explicitly as a coping mechanism, likely something he learned from the harsh background he comes from. Specifically, he's obviously not justified by any stretch of the imagination, but let's break down the evil mindset Dio has at this point in time. Dio's shown to be emotionally unstable from the beating he received, something that comes not just from the physical damage, but from the fact that his perception of others got proven wrong. Yes, he used this to lower JoJo's guard, but that's just him repurposing the situation. It wasn't all fake, people can't instantly cry at will. I really think that he couldn't take the beating to the point of pathetically crying and loading himself with insecurities, showing how disturbed this kid is. Evidently, Dio relies on his ego for emotional support, and that makes one wonder, could it be that the harsh background he comes from influenced Dio to have such a massive ego as a source of happiness and emotional stability? Could it be that he coped his own misery with excessive immoral thoughts about his own superiority, thereby removing the superiority crumbles his basic stability, leading back to misery? In that environment, he's certainly short of options to be happy and not suffer. Jumping into part 3 for a second, a more mature Dio concludes that a human's goal is to obtain peace of mind, anything they do being for that purpose. It stands to reason that this applies to a human Dio as well, even if he may not know it yet. In other words, it's all cope. The source of his actions comes from his damaged psyche, making him unhappy and altered. Dio subsequently tries to alleviate that, but his available resources to do so amount to nothing while in poverty. That much serves as an explanation of where he's coming from, but understanding one's actions and pitying their circumstances is not the same as portraying that one had no choice in the matter. It's not a justification or moral validation for his actions. Disgustingly evil as his actions were, at this point in time Dio deserved treatment to fix his internal issues. The factors that allow this to go unnoticed are very specific. He hides his evil under a mask of good manners, and so no one can see his issues. He's very competent at it, even at a young age, having something close to an adult-level intellect for criminal activities, regardless of still being a kid. And his goal requires him to antagonize his new family. Hypothetically, what if he was just as immoral but wasn't smart enough to pull this off, and didn't decide to attack his new family in any way, instead choosing alternative ways to get money? Would he be more open to his new family then? What if he wasn't competent at hiding his ego and how effortlessly he can do evil, and everyone were to see this? Or what if somehow Dario were to know what his son would do and inform the Joestars about it and the type of person Dio is? They would try to help him. The story would play out a lot different in these scenarios. Well, I'm sure that they would kick him out of the house as well under the right circumstances. Going beyond part 1, Dio shows no redeeming qualities in part 3. Stick around for part 2 of this video, and the rest of the analysis covering his character as shown to us in part 6.